Hey guys, Diaz here for FreeBalancedClasses.com. So I think today's video is long overdue, and I'm going to try to cover different aspects of hip circles that are hard for some people, the things that they struggle with, and the common mistakes I see a lot of students make, and then we'll see how we're going to fix them. Okay? So the number one thing that a lot of people forget when they learn hip circles is that there are different types of hip circles. Not just because something looks like a circle on your hip, it's a hip circle. Find out exactly what type of hip circle you're trying to learn, because the technique and the breakdown of the steps, the footwork, the hip work, the arms, etc., the speed are all going to be different depending on what type of hip circle that you're going to be learning. So that's the number one thing. Define what hip circle you're going to learn. So commonly you see there is what we call a small hip circle. Basically, you're not pushing the hips out too far. You're just like right here, and then your feet are flat in this one, okay? And you're just trying to go as far as your hips would naturally go without pushing too hard, okay? So that's a simple side hip circle, okay? And you can do it on both directions. Now, this is another common mistake that a lot of people do when they practice hip circles, is that they constantly go in one direction. Yes, we all have that one natural direction that we want to go to, but make sure you always practice both sides, because you're going to end up with a lot of muscle imbalance in your body if you keep focusing only on the side that you like, or that looks good on you, or that's easier for you. So make sure you always try both sides, okay? So that's a small hip circle. Now, this is what we call the bigger hip circle. And a big hip circle, you usually want to step out a little bit farther, a little bit wider than your hips, okay? So with the small hip circles, you're standing just about hip width apart. With an Egyptian big circle, you're standing just a little bit wider. And usually you start from this position, you know, feet width apart, hip width apart, and then you take a step to the side as you start your hip circle, your big hip circle, and then you go down, up, and so on, okay? So that's a big hip circle. And then there is what we call the Omi, which is a different type of hip circle. It's one where you actually kind of lift a little bit your heels, so your heels will be off the ground. And then you're doing the hip circle, but when you come to the front, you're actually doing a little tuck. And it's easy to tuck because you're lifting the heels and pushing the knees forward, and that helps you tuck the hips up, okay? So it's a different type of circle. The feet are definitely close together here, just like in the small circle. But when you go to the side and you come to the front, you tuck and tuck and tuck and tuck like that. Okay, so that's the Omi. And then of course there's millions of others. But for beginners, when you're just trying to learn, usually you're going to find yourself doing one of these hip circles. And then sometimes you'll learn to travel with them. So first of all, make sure you define which one. Okay, so now let's take each one of those, you know, the common ones that beginners will learn, and break them down a little bit and find out exactly what kind of mistakes we're making. So with a small hip circle is obviously the easiest one. But what I see a lot of times people do is they compare themselves with others, and they're obviously trying to have that big wide hip look, and the bigger the better. No, not in a hip circle. Keep it natural, keep it comfortable. Your upper body should stay straight and relaxed, okay? And you push the hip out to the side as far as you would naturally go. So side, back, side, and forward. Now the knees should stay locked here, your feet should stay flat, and then your shoulders will never move, because that's the other thing too, is a lot of times you'll see people try to like really make it big that the shoulders and the upper body start to move. The upper body would never move. You really want to isolate here, and you should really feel the abs. And as I said, make sure you do that on both sides. Okay, so that's the most common mistake, is people trying to push the hips out too far. The second thing is people bend the knees sometimes, and then they start to do like this hip rocking motion. Okay, so don't bend the hips when you do a simple small circle. Okay, just keep everything flat, lock the knees, and just focus on the hip motion and also on the abs. All right. The other thing I see people do sometimes is to try to like lift the heels once in a while. I don't know why. People always make movements a lot more complicated than they actually should be. But normally, you know, your feet will stay flat, your knees locked, and you should never have to lift your heels. But I see people do this, well, like, you know, they bend the knees, you know, they try to do some weird jerky motion with the footwork and the heels and thinking that that's going to help the hips move. Not really. Not in this kind of circle. Okay? The other thing I see is people just really dragging their arms and like doing this, you know. Really get the hips, get the arms out of the way first. Especially when you're learning for the first time, because you want to see the hip motion. You really want to see what you're doing. The other thing too is having something like this dragging really doesn't make you go as far as you would want to go. Okay, so don't limit yourself with your arms. Get the arms out of the way first. Either bring them to the side or all the way up. Okay, or if you want to frame the hips, you could do that, but bring them a little bit more to the back so they're not in the way sideways when you're trying to move. Okay, now let's talk about the big circles. The big circles, as I said, one of the common mistakes is that people actually don't take a bigger step to start the hip circle, the big hip circle. You know, they keep their feet just about, you know, hip width apart, and then they think that they're going to be able to push too far. You're not going to be able to, unfortunately. You have to take a step that's a little bit wider than your hips, okay, and then you push your hip out from there, and then it will feel much more natural there. Now, on a big hip circle, you need to feel free to drop your upper body to the opposite direction, okay? But again, never drop the shoulder. You always want to keep the shoulders up and the head up, and then push the hip out, okay? Because I see this sometimes like that, okay? So just pushing your hip out doesn't mean you have to drop everything. And don't push too far. You can only go so far. So just go as far as your body can handle it. You start to feel that real pull and the stretch in the ab muscle. That means you got it, you're done. That's as far as your hip would go. So from here, when you start to go back, because obviously your circle is going to have 4 corners, back and then side and then front. Sometimes people forget to bring the upper body back to the front. Because you have to, you know, you can't keep it back here and then try to bring it. I mean, your upper body should be naturally moving to the opposite direction of the hips when the hips move to the side. But when your hips are centered, you know, in the back or in the front, your upper body should be centered with them, okay? So you push to the side, upper body the opposite direction, shoulders always up. When the hip goes back, the upper body drops forward, but the chin stays up, never look down. When your butt goes back, and then as you move the hip to the opposite direction, the shoulders, the upper body also moves to the opposite direction, and the shoulder stays up, okay? And then when you bring the hip forward, you know, your upper body starts to align back again. So don't forget about that. So whenever you're in the middle, you're straight, your upper body should go with you. Whenever you're on the side, your upper body should go the opposite direction. Okay? Now from here, if you want to bring your feet together because you're doing the next thing, you can feel free to do that. But while you're doing the actual circle itself, definitely make sure that you take a step that's a little bit wider than your hips. So that's one of the most common mistakes that people make, is the upper body not going not going the opposite direction, and then they're not taking a big step when they're trying to do that big circle. Okay? So that's for the big hip circle. As far as the OMI, as I said, watch the video. There's a breakdown where I take a long time to explain to you how to do the OMI step by step. So make sure you check out that video. But the biggest mistake a lot of people make in the OMI is that they actually keep the heels on the ground. You really need to lift the heels and keep your knees together. That's the other mistake people make, is that their knees are not together, and what that does is obviously makes you lose your balance and you feel like falling. But if you keep your knees together and lift the heels, you'll be much more in control of your balance. But you cannot push the hip up forward without lifting the heels just slightly off the floor. So side, back, side. When you bring it to the front, lift. And I always like to say it's almost like zipping some tight pants. So it's not a big lift forward, but it's more like just keeping it here and then just moving the hip this way. Okay? So avoid dropping your heels and avoid opening your knees, because you will lose your balance. You're not going to be able to hold it, and even if you were able to hold it for a little bit, it's not going to make it look as smooth while you're doing it. Okay, so I'm sure there's a lot of other mistakes that people make, and I probably will cover them in the future, but for right now I just want to cover the most common ones that I see people make when they do figure eights, and see how we can fix them. So hopefully this video was helpful to you. I'll see you guys next time in another video on freebaddanceclasses.com. Bye. Subscribe. Bye.